The Denver International Airport gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a cathedral of glass and steel. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains against the darkness, each flake catching the runway lights, before disappearing into the endless white. It was the kind of night that made travelers grateful for heated terminals and hot coffee, the kind of night that made lonely people feel even lonelier. Victoria Ashford sat in the Admiral's Club lounge, her back perfectly straight against the leather chair, a crystal tumbler of 18-year-old Macallan resting untouched on the table before her. At 52 years old, she had become a woman whose very stillness commanded attention. Silver threads wove through her dark hair like veins of precious metal. Her eyes the color of storm clouds before rain surveyed the room with the practiced detachment of someone who had learned long ago that showing emotion was a luxury she could not afford. She had just closed the biggest deal of her career. Ashford Industries had swallowed Henderson Technologies in a hostile takeover that would make headlines in the morning papers. $40 billion. 3 years of strategic maneuvering. Countless sleepless nights spent reading contracts and anticipating counterattacks. And now it was done. The board had called it her masterpiece. The financial analysts were already predicting that this would cement her legacy as the most successful female CEO in American history. Victoria took a sip of whiskey. It burned going down. She felt nothing. In her Hermes handbag beneath the leather-bound notebook and the Mont Blanc pen that had signed today's papers lay a letter. She had read it 3 times on the flight from New York to Denver, and each time the words had carved a little deeper into her chest. The letter was from Gerald Morrison, the family attorney. Her ex-husband Richard wanted to sell the house in Connecticut. The house they had bought together 30 years ago when they were young and foolish, and believed that love could conquer anything. The house where they had painted the nursery pale blue. The house where they had assembled the crib, laughing at the incomprehensible instructions. The house where Theodore had never come home. Victoria closed her eyes. It had been 27 years since she had held her son for the first and last time. 72 hours. That was all Theodore had been given. 72 hours of fragile breath and tiny fingers and a heartbeat that flickered like a candle in a hurricane. She had counted every second. 259,200 seconds. And then silence. Victoria opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the window. The woman who stared back was a stranger wearing expensive clothes and a face carved from granite. Somewhere beneath that polished exterior was the 25-year-old who had screamed in a hospital room, who had begged God for a miracle that never came, who had watched her marriage crumble like Eastbash in the years that followed. But that woman was buried now, buried beneath quarterly reports and acquisition strategies and the relentless forward march of a career that had become her only reason to keep breathing. The announcement came over the speakers. Flight 847 to New York, now boarding first-class passengers. Victoria gathered her belongings with mechanical precision. She had taken this route 100 times. Denver to New York, the red-eye flight that allowed her to work through the night and arrive at her Manhattan office before dawn. It was a routine as familiar as her own heartbeat. She had no idea that tonight would change everything. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a sanctuary of muted lighting and hushed voices. Victoria settled into her seat by the window, accepting a glass of champagne from the flight attendant, with a nod that was polite but did not invite conversation. Around her, business executives tapped at their laptops and checked their phones one last time before takeoff. No one approached her. No one ever did. The media had dubbed her the Ice Queen years ago, and Victoria had long since stopped caring about the nickname. Let them think she was cold. Let them whisper about her legendary ruthlessness in the boardroom. They did not know that the ice was armor. They did not know that beneath it lay wounds that had never healed. The plane pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway. Victoria leaned her head against the window, watching the snow swirl in the darkness outside. The champagne sat untouched. The letter from Gerald Morrison burned in her bag like a hot coal. Richard wanted to sell the house. After 3 decades, he wanted to erase the last physical evidence that their son had ever existed. Victoria understood in some distant intellectual way that Richard had the right to move on. Their divorce had been finalized 15 years ago. He had remarried, had 2 daughters, with his second wife, had built a new life that did not include the ghost of a baby who had lived for only 3 days. He had done what the grief counselors always recommended. He had let go. Victoria had never learned how. Instead, she had poured her grief into Ashford Industries. Every late night, every hostile takeover, every $1 billion added to the company's valuation was a brick in the wall she had built around her heart. She had become untouchable, invincible, the most feared woman in American business, and the loneliest. The plane lifted off the runway, engines roaring against the storm outside. Victoria watched the lights of Denver shrink below, becoming a scattered constellation of gold against the black earth. The aircraft climbed through the clouds, shuddering occasionally as turbulence tested its metal wings. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. That was when she heard the crying. It started as a thin wail, distant and muffled by the curtain that separated first class from the economy cabin. At first, Victoria ignored it. Babies cried on airplanes. It was as inevitable as delays and lost luggage. The pressurized air, the unfamiliar surroundings, the disruption of routine. All of it conspired to transform even the most docile infant into a screaming banshee. But this crying did not stop. It grew louder, more desperate, piercing through the ambient noise of the aircraft with a raw intensity that made Victoria's chest tighten. She had heard that sound before, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Theodore had cried like that in the hours before the end, his tiny body fighting against the cruel genetics that had decided he would not survive. Victoria gripped the armrest of her seat. Around her, the other first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably. A man in a pinstripe suit muttered something about inconsiderate parents. A woman with diamonds dripping from her ears pressed her sleep mask more firmly against her face as if she could block out the sound through sheer force of will. The crying continued, and then Victoria heard another sound. A voice. A man's voice, ragged with exhaustion and desperation. "Please, sweetheart, please. I'm begging you. Just close your eyes. Just for a little while. Daddy's right here. Daddy's not going anywhere." Something cracked inside Victoria's chest. Before she knew what she was doing, she was unbuckling her seatbelt. She was standing. She was walking toward the curtain that separated first class from economy, her Louboutin heels clicking against the aisle floor with each step. "Ma'am," the flight attendant intercepted her with a professional smile. "Is there something I can help you with? If the noise is disturbing you, I can speak to the passenger." Victoria looked at the young woman. She saw the practiced sympathy in her eyes, the anticipation of a complaint, the readiness to apologize for something that was not her fault. "No," Victoria said. "I'll handle it myself." She pushed through the curtain before the flight attendant could respond. The economy cabin was a different world. Cramped seats packed tightly together, passengers slumped in awkward angles trying to find comfort where none existed. The air was thicker here, heavy with the smell of recycled breath and synthetic fabric. And in row 23, a man sat alone with a baby pressed against his chest. He was young, 34, maybe 35. Dark hair that looked like it had not been properly combed in days. A flannel shirt that had seen better years. Dark circles beneath his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. His hands, large and calloused from manual labor, cradled the infant with a gentleness that seemed almost painful to witness. The baby was perhaps 10 months old, a girl judging by the pink onesie that had spit-up stains on the collar. Her face was red and contorted with misery, her tiny fists beating against her father's chest as if she could fight her way out of whatever was tormenting her. "Please," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, Emma. Please." Victoria stopped in the aisle. The passengers in the surrounding rows were staring at the man with undisguised irritation. An elderly woman had pulled a pillow over her ears. A teenager in a gaming headset kept shooting dark looks over his shoulder. No one was offering to help. No one was showing the slightest compassion for a father clearly at the end of his rope. Victoria thought about the $40 billion deal she had just closed. She thought about the boardroom full of executives who had applauded her strategic brilliance. She thought about the letter in her bag, the house in Connecticut, the nursery that had never held a living child. And then she thought about Theodore, about the way his tiny hand had curled around her finger in those final hours, about the promise she had made holding him in the darkness of the hospital room that she would never forget how to love. Victoria approached row 23. The man looked up at her with eyes that held no hope, only the dull resignation of someone who had already been judged and found wanting by everyone around him. He expected her to complain. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way he pulled his daughter closer, as if to shield her from another verbal assault. "May I hold her?" The words came out softer than Victoria had intended, softer than she had spoken to anyone in years. The man stared at her. What, your daughter? Victoria kept her voice gentle, her posture non-threatening. May I hold her? Sometimes a change of arms helps. Different heartbeat, different rhythm. I don't. The man shook his head, confusion mixing with exhaustion on his face. I don't know you. No, Victoria agreed. You don't, and you have every reason to say no. But I promise you I only want to help. She extended her hands, palms up. Open, unthreatening. The baby screamed louder. Victoria waited. She understood that this man was making an impossible calculation. Trust a stranger with your most precious possession or continue suffering alone. There was no right answer. There was only exhaustion and desperation and the hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe had sent someone to help. The man looked at his daughter, at her red face and her flailing fists and her tiny body rigid with distress. Then he looked at Victoria. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding that they were both drowning in different ways in different oceans, but drowning nonetheless. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay. He lifted the baby toward her. The moment Emma settled into Victoria's arms, something shifted. It was muscle memory, pure and primal and unchanged by decades of disuse. Victoria's body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The precise angle to hold an infant against her chest, the exact position of her hand beneath the small head, the rhythm of her breathing, slow and steady, designed to communicate safety through the simple rise and fall of her chest. She had practiced this for 9 months before Theodore was born. She had read every book, watched every video, taken every class the hospital offered. She had been so determined to be the perfect mother, so certain that preparation could guarantee success. It had not saved her son, but the knowledge remained buried in her bones like sediment at the bottom of a deep lake. Victoria shifted Emma to her shoulder. She placed her palm flat against the baby's back, feeling the rapid flutter of a terrified heartbeat. She began to pat, slow, rhythmic, the exact tempo of a resting pulse. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Her body began to sway almost imperceptibly, a gentle rocking motion that mimicked the movement of the womb. She did not think about what she was doing. She simply did it. The crying began to soften. 1 by only 2, 3. Emma's rigid body started to relax. Her fists unclenched. Her face pressed against the silk of Victoria's blouse lost its angry red color. 1, 2, 3. The baby let out a shuddering sigh, a sound of surrender, a sound of trust. 1, 2, 3. 90 seconds after Victoria had taken her into her arms, Emma was asleep. The silence that followed was profound. It spread through the economy cabin like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Passengers who had been glaring in frustration now stared with open amazement. The flight attendant who had followed Victoria through the curtain with obvious concern stood frozen in the aisle with her mouth slightly open. Marcus Holloway sat motionless in his seat. His arms were still curved in the shape of holding his daughter. His eyes were fixed on Victoria and Emma, with an expression that mixed disbelief with something else, something that looked almost like hope. Victoria did not acknowledge any of them. She simply stood in the aisle swaying gently, her hand continuing its slow rhythm against the sleeping baby's back. The weight of the child against her shoulder was at once foreign and achingly familiar. For all those years, her arms had been empty. How? Marcus's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. How did you do that? Victoria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. She saw the wedding ring still on his finger, worn and scratched from hard labor. She saw the formula stains on his collar and the spit-up spots on his jeans and the raw desperation of a man trying to hold his world together with both hands. Practice, she said quietly, a long time ago. The word carried more weight than it should have. Marcus seemed to sense it. He did not ask for clarification. Would you mind if I sat down? Victoria gestured to the empty middle seat beside him. In case she wakes. Marcus nodded quickly, gathering the scattered baby supplies that had accumulated on the seat during his battle with his daughter's tears. Diapers, wipes, a bottle of formula that had gone cold, a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. Victoria lowered herself into the seat with care, adjusting Emma's position to keep her comfortable. The baby sighed in her sleep and nestled closer. For a long moment, neither adult spoke. The engines hummed their constant white noise. The cabin lights had been dimmed to their nighttime setting, casting everything in shades of blue and amber. Outside the windows, the world was nothing but darkness and stars. "I'm Marcus," the man finally said. "Marcus Holloway." Victoria. She did not offer her last name. Marcus nodded, accepting this partial introduction. He was too tired to push for more information, and Victoria suspected he was too overwhelmed to care about the details of who she was. At this moment, she was simply the stranger who had given him a moment of peace. "She's beautiful," Victoria said softly, looking down at Emma's sleeping face. "How old? 10 months. And her name, Emma." Marcus's voice caught on the word. "Named after my wife's grandmother." Victoria heard the past tense. Wife's grandmother, not wife's grandmother's name. She heard the way he said wife as if the word itself caused him pain. She did not ask the obvious question. Instead, she simply nodded, her hand continuing its gentle rhythm against Emma's back. She understood that some wounds required invitation, not interrogation. She understood that grief was a private country, and you could not enter without being asked. But Marcus spoke anyway. Perhaps it was the exhaustion that had stripped away his defenses. Perhaps it was the strange intimacy of the darkened cabin, the altitude that seemed to separate them from the real world below. Perhaps it was simply that Victoria listened in a way that most people did not, without interruption, without judgment, without the frantic need to fill silence with empty words. "Sarah," he said, "my wife, she passed away." Victoria felt the words land in her chest like stones. Complications after the delivery. Marcus was staring at his hands as he spoke, unable to meet her eyes. "She got to hold Emma once for about 10 minutes. She was so happy. She kept saying, 'Look at her, Marcus. Look at our baby girl.' And then," he stopped, swallowed, started again. "And then she was gone. Just like that. 10 minutes of being a mother and then nothing." Victoria's hands stilled on Emma's back. She thought about Theodore, about the 3 days she had been given with her son, about the way she had memorized every detail of his face, knowing that memory would be all she had left. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were inadequate, but they were all she had. Marcus shook his head. "Everyone says that. They're sorry. They can't imagine. They're praying for us." A bitter laugh escaped him. "None of it means anything. None of it brings her back. None of it makes it easier to get up at 3 in the morning when Emma's crying, and I haven't slept in 48 hours, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong." "You're not doing anything wrong." Victoria's voice was quiet but firm. Marcus looked at her, surprised by her certainty. "Babies cry," Victoria continued. "It's how they communicate before they have words. It doesn't mean you're failing. It means your daughter is alive and has needs and trusts you enough to tell you about them. That's not failure, that's love." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Something that might have been gratitude, or recognition, or simply the relief of being seen. "You sound like you know something about it," he said carefully. Victoria was silent for a moment. She looked down at Emma, at the way the baby's fingers had curled around a fold of her silk blouse, at the peaceful expression on the small face that had been contorted with misery just minutes ago. "I once hoped to have a child," she said finally. "It didn't work out the way I planned." She did not elaborate. She could not. Not now. Not with this stranger who had no idea who she was or what she had lost. The words were locked too deep, buried beneath years of grief and silence, and the relentless forward momentum of a life built on the ruins of her dreams. But Marcus seemed to understand. He nodded slowly, asking nothing more, and they sat together in the darkness of the cabin, two strangers bound by losses they could not fully share, while the baby slept peacefully between them. The hours passed in a strange, suspended way. Victoria and Marcus talked intermittently, the conversation flowing in fits and starts like a river finding its path through rocky terrain. He told her about his job at the distribution center in Denver, the double shifts he worked to pay for the house and the insurance, and all the expenses that came with raising a child alone. He told her about his mother who helped when she could, but was battling her own health problems. He told her about the nights when Emma would not stop crying and he would walk the floors of his small apartment until dawn, wondering if this was what his life would look like forever. Victoria listened. She did not offer advice or solutions. She did not try to fix his problems with money or connections. She simply listened, and something in her chest that had been frozen for years began to thaw. When Emma stirred, Victoria adjusted her position automatically, the gentle patting resuming without conscious thought. The baby settled immediately, her trust in this stranger absolute and unquestioning. "You're good at that," Marcus said, watching with something like awe in his exhausted eyes. Victoria felt the familiar ache in her chest, the phantom pain of arms that had held a child for only 3 days, the muscle memory that had never been allowed to fade. "Practice," she said again, and the word tasted like ash on her tongue. Marcus did not push. He simply nodded and leaned his head against the window, his eyes finally closing as exhaustion claimed him. Victoria sat in the silence holding his daughter and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. The plane began its descent into New York as the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon. The cabin stirred with the familiar sounds of passengers preparing for arrival. Seatbelts clicked. Tray tables folded. The flight attendant made her announcements about connecting flights and ground transportation, her voice cheerful despite the early hour. Victoria had returned Emma to Marcus's arms sometime during the night, but the baby had remained asleep, her face peaceful, in a way that seemed almost miraculous. Now, as the plane descended through the clouds, Marcus gathered his scattered belongings with one hand while cradling his daughter with the other. "Thank you," he said, looking at Victoria with an expression that held more gratitude than words could convey. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Victoria nodded. "Take care of her," she said. "Take care of yourself." She stood to return to the first-class cabin to retrieve her bag and prepare for the arrival that would launch her back into the world of board meetings and quarterly reports and the crushing weight of running a $40 billion empire. But something made her hesitate. Emma's breathing. Victoria had noticed it during the night, a subtle wheeze that appeared whenever the baby inhaled deeply. It was faint enough to miss if you were not paying attention. Faint enough to dismiss as nothing. But Victoria had spent 3 days listening to her son's breathing, waiting for each exhale, praying for each inhale. She had learned to hear the difference between normal and not normal. She had learned that sometimes the smallest sounds carried the biggest warnings. "Has she seen a doctor recently?" Victoria asked, keeping her voice casual. "Her pediatrician, I mean, for a routine checkup." Marcus looked surprised by the question. "About a month ago, they said she was healthy, growing well." "Did they mention anything about her breathing? Any respiratory concerns?" "No." Marcus's brow furrowed with sudden worry. "Why does she sound okay to you?" Victoria hesitated. She did not want to alarm him. She did not want to insert herself further into the life of a stranger she would never see again. She did not want to feel the weight of responsibility for another child's health, another parent's fear. But she also could not walk away without saying something. "It's probably nothing," she said carefully. "But I noticed a slight wheeze when she breathes deeply. The altitude changes on planes can be difficult for infants with respiratory sensitivities. It might be worth having her checked out just to be safe." Marcus looked down at his daughter, his expression shifting from relief to concern in the space of a heartbeat. Emma slept on, oblivious to the worry now creasing her father's face. "I'll take her to the pediatrician as soon as we get home," he said. Victoria nodded. It was enough. She had done what she could, said what needed to be said. Now it was time to return to her own life, her own problems, her own carefully constructed world of walls and distance. She turned to go. "Wait," Marcus's voice stopped her. "I don't even know your last name," he said. "How can I thank you properly if I don't know who you are?" Victoria looked at him, at his tired eyes and his wrinkled flannel, and his daughter sleeping peacefully against his chest. She looked at this man who had trusted her with his most precious possession, who had shared his grief with a stranger in the darkness, who had no idea that the woman standing before him could buy his apartment building without noticing the expense. For a moment she considered lying, giving a false name, disappearing into the anonymity that had protected her for so long. But something in Marcus's eyes stopped her. Something honest and open and desperately human. "Ashford," she said quietly. "Victoria Ashford." The recognition did not come immediately. Marcus frowned clearly, searching his memory for why the name sounded familiar. Victoria saw the exact moment it clicked. His eyes widened. His face went pale. Victoria Ashford, he repeated slowly, as in Ashford Industries, the the Forbes covers, the yes. The single word hung between them like a verdict. Marcus stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, and in a way he was. The woman who had held his crying baby, who had listened to his grief without judgment, who had spoken of her own lost hopes with such quiet pain, was suddenly transformed into someone else entirely. Someone whose face appeared on magazine covers. Someone whose business decisions moved markets. Someone whose net worth was measured in billions. The Ice Queen. Marcus had read the articles like everyone else. The ruthless CEO who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry. The woman who had destroyed competitors without mercy. The businesswoman who, according to the tabloids, had never shown a human emotion in her entire career. That woman bore no resemblance to the person who had swayed gently in a cramped airplane aisle humming softly to a stranger's baby. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would someone like you?" He trailed off, unable to articulate the question that was clearly consuming him. Why would a billionaire sit in economy class with a broke single father? Why would the most powerful woman in American business hold a screaming infant? Why would the Ice Queen show more warmth in a few hours than most people showed in a lifetime? Victoria understood his confusion. She had spent years cultivating an image designed specifically to prevent moments like this. The cold exterior, the professional distance, the armor of wealth and power that kept everyone at arm's length. But tonight, in the darkness of that airplane cabin, she had forgotten to be Victoria Ashford's CEO. She had simply been Victoria, a woman with empty arms and a broken heart and the desperate need to feel something other than grief. "I should go," she said, suddenly aware of the attention gathering around them. Other passengers had begun to recognize her. Phones were being raised. The whispered name Ashford rippled through the cabin like electricity. "Wait." Marcus stood awkwardly, Emma still pressed against his chest. "Please. I want to thank you properly. For everything. There's nothing to thank me for." "That's not true." His voice was firm despite his exhaustion. "You gave me hope tonight. You gave my daughter peace. That's not nothing. That's everything." Victoria felt the words land in her heart like seeds falling on barren ground. How long had it been since anyone had seen past her carefully constructed walls? How long had it been since anyone had spoken to her as a human being rather than a name on a stock ticker? "Take care of Emma," Victoria said, her voice barely steady. "Get her breathing checked. And if you ever need anything." She reached into her bag and produced a business card. Simple white, black lettering. No title or logo. Just her name and a phone number that bypassed every secretary and assistant and gatekeeper between the outside world and Victoria Ashford. "Don't hesitate," she said, pressing the card into his hand. Then she turned and walked away through the curtain into first class, away from Marcus and Emma and the strange magic of the night that had somehow broken through her defenses. The jet bridge at JFK was crowded with passengers eager to escape the confines of the aircraft. Victoria moved through them with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to navigating obstacles, her carry-on bag slung over one shoulder, her expression carefully neutral. At the end of the bridge, a man in a dark suit stood waiting. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an earpiece visible beneath his close-cropped hair, and the alert posture of someone trained to watch for threats. When he saw Victoria, he straightened immediately. "Miss Ashford." He stepped forward to take her bag. "The car is waiting. The Henderson acquisition press release has been drafted for your approval, and Mr. Morrison called again about the Connecticut property. He says Mr. Ashford is insisting on a response by end of week." Victoria felt the weight of her real life settling back onto her shoulders. The brief respite of the night was over. The walls were going up again, brick by careful brick. "Tell Gerald I'll call him tomorrow," she said, "and have the press release sent to my phone. I'll review it in the car." "Yes, ma'am." They were halfway through the terminal when Victoria heard footsteps behind her. Hurried, uneven, the stride of someone carrying a heavy load. She turned. Marcus was there, Emma strapped to his chest, a diaper bag hanging from one shoulder and a backpack from the other. He was breathing hard, clearly having run to catch up with her. "Wait," he said. Please, just one more second. Victoria's security chief shifted his weight, ready to intervene. She stopped him with a small gesture. Mr. Holloway, I just wanted to say, Marcus paused, struggling to catch his breath. What you did tonight, it meant something. Not because of who you are or what you can do, but because you saw me, you saw Emma, and you helped even though you had no reason to. He looked at her with those exhausted eyes that had seen too much grief and not enough kindness. The world thinks you're cold, he said quietly. The newspapers call you the Ice Queen, but they're wrong. They don't know you at all. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the ice that had protected her heart for so long. They know what I show them, she said. Then show them something different. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Show them what I caught tonight. Show them that Victoria Ashford has a heart. Before Victoria could respond, a flash went off nearby. Then another. The photographers had found them. A small group near the arrival gate, cameras already aimed, fingers already clicking. Of course. Victoria Ashford could not move through an airport without attracting attention. And now here she was standing with a disheveled man and a baby, looking for all the world like something she was not. The headlines were already writing themselves. Ice Queen's secret family. Billionaire CEO's hidden life. Victoria Ashford shows unexpected warmth. Victoria felt the familiar instinct to create distance, to retreat behind the walls that had protected her for so long. She should walk away, return to the car, let her PR team handle whatever narrative emerged from these photographs. But Emma chose that moment to wake up. The baby's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Victoria's face with that peculiar intensity that infants sometimes have. A small hand reached toward her fingers, grasping at the air, and something in Victoria's heart broke completely open. Let me hold her, she said to Marcus, just for a moment. She took Emma into her arms, feeling the familiar weight, the perfect fit of a small body against her shoulder. The cameras continued their assault, capturing every second. But Victoria did not care. For once, she did not care what the world would think or say or write. She was holding a child. And somewhere in whatever came after this life, maybe Theodore was watching. Maybe he understood. Thank you, Victoria whispered to Emma, though the words were meant for someone else entirely. Thank you for tonight. She returned the baby to Marcus with a tenderness that the cameras would capture and the tabloids would dissect, and the world would never understand. Get her breathing checked, Victoria said. And if the doctors find anything concerning, call me immediately. That number bypasses everything. I'll answer day or night. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with emotions he was clearly struggling to contain. Why so? He asked. Why do you care so much about a stranger's baby? Victoria looked at him. At Emma, at the future she had lost, in the past she could not escape. Because a long time ago, she said quietly, I sat in a hospital room and watched my son take his last breath, and there was nothing anyone could do to save him. Nothing anyone could offer except prayers that didn't work and sympathy that meant nothing. She paused, the words coming from a place she had locked away for nearly 3 decades. Your daughter is alive, Mr. Holloway. She has a chance. She has a future. And if there is anything in this world I can do to protect, that I will do it. Not for you, not for recognition, not for karma or redemption or whatever people think motivates billionaires to perform acts of charity. She touched Emma's cheek one last time. For him, she said, for my son, so that his death means something, so that the love I couldn't give him goes somewhere, to someone. Marcus stared at her, tears streaming down his face. The cameras continued to flash, and Victoria Ashford, the Ice Queen, stood in the middle of JFK Airport and let the world see her cry. The photograph appeared on every major news website within 6 hours. Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries, standing in the middle of JFK Airport with tears streaming down her face. A disheveled man beside her, a baby in her arms. The image was grainy, captured on a smartphone by a passenger who had no idea they were holding a goldmine. But the emotion in it was unmistakable. The Ice Queen was crying. By noon, the story had gone viral. Every cable news channel ran segments speculating about the identity of the mystery man and child. Entertainment reporters dug through Victoria's past, searching for evidence of a secret family. Financial analysts debated whether the photographs would affect Ashford Industries' stock price. And in her penthouse office overlooking Central Park, Victoria sat alone and watched the chaos unfold. The mahogany desk before her was covered with reports and contracts and the accumulated paperwork of running a $40 billion empire. But she had not looked at any of it. Her eyes were fixed on the television mounted on the wall where a blonde anchor was breathlessly describing what she called the scandal of the decade. Sources close to Ashford Industries tell us that board members are deeply concerned about these photographs, the anchor said. While there is no evidence of any wrongdoing, the perception of a secret family could raise questions about Victoria Ashford's judgment and her commitment to the company she has led for the past 15 years. Victoria reached for the remote and turned off the television. The silence that followed was deafening. She thought about Marcus Holloway, about the way he had looked at her in the airport, tears on his face, gratitude in his eyes. She thought about Emma and the way the baby's small hand had reached toward her, trusting and innocent, and completely unaware that their brief connection would become front-page news. She thought about Theodore. All those years ago, there had been no photographers, no headlines, no public spectacle of grief, just a hospital room and a chaplain, and the quiet devastation of a life that had ended before it truly began. Victoria had wanted privacy then. She had wanted to mourn her son in silence, away from the prying eyes of a world that could not possibly understand her pain. And she had gotten her wish. Theodore's death had never made the news. His existence had been erased from the public record known only to Victoria and Richard, and a handful of medical professionals bound by confidentiality. But secrets had a way of rotting from the inside. For nearly 3 decades, Victoria had carried her grief alone. She had built walls around her heart so high that no one could see over them. She had transformed herself into the Ice Queen, a woman without weakness, without vulnerability, without the capacity for human emotion. And now, in a single night, a crying baby and an exhausted father had brought those walls crashing down. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Victoria dressed carefully, choosing armor rather than clothing, a charcoal Armani suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, heels high enough to look every man in the room directly in the eye, hair pulled back in a severe chignon that left no room for softness or sentiment. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger. The woman in the reflection was powerful and polished and completely in control. She bore no resemblance to the woman who had swayed in an airplane aisle humming lullabies to a stranger's child. She bore no resemblance to the mother who had held her dying son and begged God for a miracle. That woman was dangerous. That woman felt things. That woman could be hurt. Victoria turned away from the mirror and walked toward the elevator. The boardroom of Ashford Industries occupied the entire 52nd floor of the building Victoria had built from nothing. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, the city sprawling below like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. A conference table that could seat 30 people dominated the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting the faces of the men and women who controlled billions of dollars in assets. Victoria had sat at the head of that table for 15 years. She had made decisions that shaped industries, destroyed competitors, and transformed Ashford Industries from a struggling tech startup into one of the most valuable companies in America. Today, she walked into the room and felt like an intruder. The board members were already seated. 12 faces turned toward her as she entered, their expressions ranging from concern to curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Victoria cataloged each reaction automatically, the way a general surveys a battlefield. And then she saw him. Richard Ashford sat at the far end of the table in a seat that should have been empty. He was 60 years old now, his hair silver and his face lined with the passage of time. But his eyes were the same as they had been 30 years ago, when he had stood beside her at the altar and promised to love her until death parted them. Those eyes held no love now, only calculation. Richard, Victoria's voice was perfectly neutral. I wasn't aware you were attending today's meeting. The board invited me, Richard replied, his tone equally measured. Given the circumstances, they felt my perspective might be valuable. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table, refusing to show any reaction to this ambush. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in a room full of predators was the fastest way to be devoured. The circumstances, she repeated. You mean the photographs? I mean your behavior. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table before him. The photographs are merely evidence of a larger pattern: erratic decisions, unexplained absences, an apparent obsession with a child who is not your own. I was being a decent human being, Victoria said coldly. I helped a struggling father on an airplane. I fail to see how that constitutes erratic behavior. You were photographed crying in a public airport. Richard's voice was sharp with contempt. You were holding a stranger's baby like it was your own child. You gave your personal phone number to a man you had known for less than 5 hours. These are not the actions of a stable executive. Victoria felt the temperature in the room drop. The other board members were watching the exchange like spectators at a boxing match, waiting to see who would land the first devastating blow. What exactly are you suggesting, Richard? I'm suggesting that you are not fit to lead this company. He paused, letting the words sink in. I'm suggesting that your judgment has been compromised by unresolved grief. I'm suggesting that you are still, after all these years, unable to move past what happened when Theodore died. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had held her hand during labor, who had wept beside her when Theodore took his first breath, who had stood in frozen silence when their son took his last. The man who had filed for divorce 18 months later, citing irreconcilable differences. The man who had remarried within a year and started a new family, erasing Theodore from his life as if their son had never existed. You want to talk about what happened? Victoria's voice was dangerously quiet. Fine. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the 3 days we spent in that hospital room watching our son fight for his life. Let's talk about the moment the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. Let's talk about holding Theodore while he died, feeling his heart stop beating, knowing that we would never see him grow up. Her voice cracked on the last words, but she pushed through. You moved on, Richard. You remarried. You had other children. You built a new life and pretended that Theodore never existed. And I respected that. I never spoke about him publicly. I never shared our grief with the world. I protected your privacy and his memory for all these years. She stood slowly, her palms pressed flat against the conference table. But you don't get to use my grief as a weapon against me. You don't get to sit in this room and suggest that loving our son makes me unfit to lead. And you certainly don't get to profit from the photograph of me helping a child who reminded me of everything we lost. Victoria looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. If anyone in this room believes that showing compassion makes me weak, you are welcome to vote for my removal. But know this, I built this company from nothing. I made every one of you rich beyond your wildest dreams. And I did it while carrying a grief that would have destroyed a lesser person. She gathered her things with deliberate slowness. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She walked out of the boardroom without looking back, her heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. Behind her, the silence was deafening. 2 months passed. Victoria threw herself into work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. The Henderson acquisition required endless meetings and negotiations and legal reviews. New products needed to be approved. International expansions needed to be planned. There was always something to do, something to occupy her mind, something to keep her from thinking about the night on the airplane. But every evening when the office emptied and the city lights came on outside her window, Victoria found herself reaching for her phone. She had hired a private investigator, not to dig into Marcus Holloway's past or uncover any secrets, just to check on Emma, to ensure that the baby was healthy, that she was being cared for, that the respiratory issues Victoria had noticed had been properly addressed. The reports came weekly. Emma was thriving. Marcus had taken her to a pediatric pulmonologist who had prescribed preventive medication. The baby was gaining weight, meeting developmental milestones, showing every sign of a healthy and happy child. Victoria read each report with a mixture of relief and longing. She told herself she was simply being thorough. She told herself that her concern for Emma was natural, given the circumstances of their meeting. She told herself that once she was certain the child was healthy, she would stop the surveillance and move on with her life. But late at night, alone in her penthouse apartment, she found herself looking at the photographs the investigator had included with his reports. Emma in a stroller at the park. Emma in a high chair covered in pureed carrots. Emma laughing at something off camera, her face alight with the pure joy that only infants can express. And Victoria would think about Theodore, about the photographs she had never been able to take, about the milestones he had never reached, about the life he had never lived. She had not cried since the night in the airport. She had locked that vulnerability away, buried it beneath the armor she had rebuilt in the weeks since the board meeting. But sometimes, looking at those photographs of Emma, she felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. Marcus had not called. Victoria checked her phone more often than she cared to admit, but the number she had given him remained silent. She understood. He had his own life, his own struggles, his own reasons for keeping his distance. The viral photographs had probably made him wary of any further contact with her. The last thing a struggling single father needed was to become tabloid fodder. But understanding did not stop her from hoping. And then 8 weeks after the night on the airplane, everything changed. The call came at 3 in the morning. Victoria was asleep or trying to be. She had been lying in bed for hours staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the thoughts that churned endlessly through her mind. The phone's buzz cut through the darkness like a knife. She grabbed it automatically, expecting a crisis at the office, a problem with the Henderson integration, another emergency that required her immediate attention. Instead, she saw a notification from the private investigator. Urgent subject admitted to Denver General Hospital. Infant respiratory distress. Father present. Situation appears serious. Victoria sat up in bed, her heart suddenly pounding. She read the message again, and again, and again. Emma was in the hospital. For a long moment, Victoria could not move. She was frozen, paralyzed by a fear that was decades old and still as fresh as the day Theodore had died. Respiratory distress. The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. She thought about Theodore in his incubator, surrounded by machines and monitors and doctors who could not save him. She thought about the sound of the alarm when his heart stopped beating. She thought about the silence that followed. And then she thought about Marcus, sitting alone in a hospital room, watching his daughter fight for her life, wondering if he was about to lose the only family he had left. Victoria was out of bed before she made a conscious decision. She was dressed and in the elevator before she had a plan. She was in the back of her car, heading to the private airport before she allowed herself to acknowledge what she was doing. She was going to Denver. Dawn was breaking over the Rocky Mountains when Victoria's plane touched down at Denver International Airport. She had not slept during the flight. She had spent the hours reviewing the updates from her investigator, learning everything she could about Emma's condition. Pneumonia complicated by the underlying respiratory sensitivity Victoria had noticed on the airplane. Serious but treatable if caught in time. If caught in time. The words haunted her as the car wound through the streets of Denver toward the hospital. The city was just waking up, the first commuters beginning their journeys, the morning light casting long shadows across the urban landscape. Everything looked normal, peaceful, completely at odds with the fear that gripped Victoria's heart. Denver General Hospital was a sprawling complex of buildings that had clearly been expanded and renovated multiple times over the decades. Victoria walked through the entrance with purpose, her expensive clothes drawing curious glances from the staff and patients who filled the waiting areas. She had already obtained Emma's room number from her investigator. 3rd floor, pediatric intensive care. Room 317. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, Victoria stepped into a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, child was crying. The sound transported her instantly, violently, to another hospital in another time. She forced herself to keep walking. Room 317 was at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Victoria could see the edge of a hospital bed and the steady green lines of a heart monitor. She pushed the door open. Marcus sat in a chair beside the bed, his head bowed, his hands clasped around his daughter's tiny fingers. He looked even worse than he had on the airplane. Dark circles carved like wounds beneath his eyes. Stubble that had progressed to the beginnings of a beard. Clothes that looked like he had been wearing them for days. He did not look up when she entered. Emma lay in the bed, small and fragile, beneath the white hospital sheets. An oxygen mask covered her face. IV lines snaked from her tiny arms to the machines that surrounded her like silent guardians. Her chest rose and fell with each mechanical breath, the rhythm steady, but somehow wrong. Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had promised herself she would never stand in a room like this again, watching a child fight for life powerless to do anything but wait and hope and pray. She had been wrong. "What are you doing here?" Marcus's voice was flat, exhausted. He still had not looked up. "I heard about Emma." Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "I had to come. You had to come." Now he looked at her, and his eyes were filled with something that might have been anger, or might have been grief, or might have been both. "The billionaire CEO had to fly across the country to watch my daughter die." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. "She's not going to die." "You don't know that." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "You don't know anything. You held her once on an airplane, and now you think you have the right to be here to watch this." "I'm not here to watch." Victoria stood her ground. "I'm here to help." "Help," Marcus laughed, and the sound was bitter and broken. "Help Hal throw money at the problem. Buy some fancy specialist who can't do anything the doctors here aren't already doing. Save my daughter, so you can feel good about yourself, so you can tell your rich friends that you did something meaningful with your billions." He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his voice cracking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. "I don't want your help. I don't want your money. I don't want your charity. I just want my daughter to live." Victoria let him rage. She understood. She had said similar things to the doctors and nurses and chaplains who had tried to comfort her during Theodore's final hours. She had screamed at God and the universe and anyone who dared to offer sympathy instead of solutions. When Marcus finally stopped, his chest heaving, his eyes red and swollen, Victoria spoke. "You asked me at the airport why I cared so much about a stranger's baby," she said quietly. "I told you about my son, but I didn't tell you everything." Marcus stared at her, his anger momentarily suspended. His name was Theodore. He was born with a rare genetic condition. The doctors told us before he was born that his chances were slim, but I carried him anyway. I felt him kick inside me. I sang to him. I told him stories. I loved him before I ever saw his face. Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "He lived for 3 days. 3 days of watching monitors and praying for miracles and bargaining with a God I wasn't sure I believed in. 3 days of holding his tiny hand and telling him that everything would be okay even though I knew it wouldn't be." She took a step closer to Marcus. "When he died, I was alone. My husband was there physically, but he had already checked out emotionally. He couldn't handle the grief. He couldn't look at me without seeing the child we had lost. Our marriage ended 18 months later." Another step. "I built Ashford Industries to fill the hole that Theodore left. Every acquisition, every $1 billion, every headline about the Ice Queen was another brick in the wall I built around my heart. I thought if I could just become powerful enough, successful enough, untouchable enough, the pain would stop." She was standing directly in front of Marcus now, close enough to touch him. "It never stopped. It never even faded. I still dream about him every night. I still count the seconds. I still wonder what he would have looked like at 5 at 10 and at the age he would be now. I still grieve the life he never got to live." Victoria reached out and placed her hand on Marcus's arm. "I'm not here to throw money at your problem or to feel good about myself. I'm here because when I sat in that hospital room all those years ago, no one came. No one understood. No one knew what to say or do, so they stayed away, and I faced the worst moment of my life completely alone." Her eyes met his. "I will not let you face this alone." Marcus broke. The anger that had sustained him for days crumbled like a dam giving way to floodwaters. He collapsed into Victoria, his body shaking with sobs, his grief and fear and exhaustion pouring out into a torrent that he could no longer contain. Victoria held him. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She did not promise that everything would be okay. She simply held him, her arms wrapped around his trembling body, her own tears falling silently onto his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time. When Marcus finally pulled away, his face was swollen and his eyes were red, but something had shifted in his expression. The anger was gone, replaced by something softer. Something that looked almost like trust. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word." Victoria's voice was gentle. "And you had every right to say it. I am a stranger. I do have money. And I can't guarantee that Emma will survive. She looked at the small figure in the hospital bed. But I can make sure she has every possible chance. I can bring in the best specialists in the country. I can ensure she gets treatments that might not be available at a public hospital. And I can sit here beside you for as long as it takes so that you don't have to face this alone. Marcus followed her gaze to his daughter. Why, he asked, why do you care so much? Victoria was silent for a moment. Because Theodore taught me how to love in 3 days, she finally said. And that love has been searching for somewhere to go ever since. Every day, for all these years, I have carried the weight of a mother's love with no child to give it to. She turned back to Marcus. Your daughter gave me purpose on that airplane. She let me hold her. She let me comfort her. She let me feel for a few hours what it might have been like if Theodore had lived. Victoria's voice cracked. I know I'm not her mother. I know I have no claim on her life. But if there is anything I can do to save her, I will do it. Not because I want recognition or gratitude, but because the love I couldn't give Theodore has to go somewhere. And right now it's telling me to help Emma. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The machines beeped their steady rhythms. Emma breathed in and out, fighting her tiny battle against the illness that threatened to take her. Okay, Marcus said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. Okay. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Victoria made phone calls. Specialists were consulted. Treatments were adjusted. Equipment was brought in that the hospital had never seen before. The attending physicians, initially skeptical of outside interference, became believers when they saw the resources Victoria could mobilize. And through it all, Victoria stayed. She did not return to New York. She did not check on the Henderson integration or review the quarterly projections or attend to any of the 1,000 details that usually consumed her days. She simply stayed in room 317, sitting vigil beside Marcus, watching Emma fight for her life. They talked during the long hours of waiting. Marcus told her about Sarah, about the way they had met at a coffee shop in Denver, both reaching for the same cup by mistake, about their wedding in a small church surrounded by family and friends who wished them well, about the joy they had felt when they learned Sarah was pregnant, and about the devastating moment when the doctors told him Sarah was gone. Victoria listened. She understood the geography of grief, the way it carved new landscapes in your soul, leaving you forever changed. She understood the loneliness of losing the person who knew you best, the silence that filled the spaces where their voice used to be. In turn, she told him more about Theodore, about the nursery she had decorated with such hope, about the tiny clothes she had washed and folded and never gotten to use, about the terror and love and desperate prayer, about the moment the machines went silent and her world ended. She told him things she had never told anyone. Not Richard, who had retreated into his own grief and never truly heard her. Not the therapist she had seen over the years who offered techniques and strategies, but never really understood. Not the journalist who had tried to uncover her past searching for scandal, where there was only sorrow. She told Marcus everything. And somehow in that hospital room surrounded by machines and monitors and the constant beeping of Emma's heartbeat, Victoria felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt understood. On the third day, Emma opened her eyes. Victoria was alone in the room when it happened. Marcus had finally agreed to get some food from the cafeteria, his exhaustion making him unsteady on his feet. Victoria had promised to stay with Emma to watch over her while he was gone. She was holding the baby's hand, marveling at how small the fingers were when Emma's eyelids fluttered. For a moment, Victoria could not breathe. Emma's eyes focused, slowly adjusting to the light, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. And then they found Victoria's face. The baby did not cry. She did not reach for a parent who was not there. She simply looked at Victoria with those wide, trusting eyes, and something in her expression seemed to say, I know you, I remember you. Hello, sweetheart. Victoria's voice was thick with tears. Your daddy is getting some food. He'll be right back. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Emma's tiny hand squeezed Victoria's finger, and Victoria wept. She wept for Theodore, for the moments they had never shared, for the birthdays and graduations, and ordinary afternoons that she had never gotten to experience with her son. She wept for Emma, for this precious child who had been given a second chance, whose future stretched out before her like an unwritten book. She wept for Marcus, for the wife he had lost, for the strength he had shown in raising his daughter, alone for the fear he had carried, and the hope he had refused to abandon. And she wept for herself, for the woman she had been before Theodore died, full of dreams and plans, and the naive belief that love could conquer anything. For the woman she had become, armored in ice and success and the relentless pursuit of a goal that could never fill the emptiness inside her. When Marcus returned, he found Victoria still holding Emma's hand, tears streaming down her face, a smile on her lips. She woke up, Victoria said. She looked right at me. She squeezed my hand. Marcus rushed to the bedside, his food forgotten, his eyes fixed on his daughter's face. Emma turned at the sound of his voice, her expression transforming into something that was almost a smile. "Hey, baby girl," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "Daddy's here, Daddy's right here." Victoria stepped back, giving them space. She watched as father and daughter reconnected as Marcus touched Emma's face and kissed her forehead and told her over and over that he loved her. And she thought about Theodore, about the 3 days she had been given with her son, about the love that had compressed a lifetime into those precious hours, about the way his eyes had looked at her, trusting and peaceful in those final moments before he slipped away. Victoria had spent years running from that memory, building walls, constructing defenses, becoming someone who could not be hurt because she could not be touched. But watching Marcus with Emma, seeing the love that flowed between them like an electrical current, Victoria understood something she had been unable to see before. Grief was not something to be escaped. It was something to be honored. Theodore's death had carved a hole in her heart, but that hole was also a vessel, a container for the love she had not been able to give him, a capacity for connection that no amount of success or wealth or power could ever fill. For so long, she had been pouring that love into the wrong places, into companies and acquisitions in the endless pursuit of more. She had been trying to fill the void with things that could not possibly fit. But here in this hospital room, watching a father reunite with his daughter, Victoria finally understood what Theodore had been trying to teach her. Love was not about holding on. It was about giving freely without expectation of return. It was about showing up for the people who needed you even when it was hard. It was about allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to be hurt, to be changed. Theodore had given her that love for 3 days. And now, all these years later, it was time to pass it on. Victoria looked at Marcus and Emma, at the joy and relief on their faces, at the future that stretched out before them, full of possibility. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not sure who she was thanking. Maybe Marcus, maybe Emma, maybe Theodore, maybe all of them. And for the first time in a very long time, Victoria Ashford felt something other than grief. She felt hope. Emma recovered. It took 2 weeks of treatment, endless adjustments to medication, and the tireless efforts of specialists that Victoria had brought in from across the country. But slowly, steadily, the color returned to Emma's cheeks. Her breathing grew stronger. The machines that had surrounded her like sentinels were removed one by one until only the standard monitors remained. Victoria stayed through all of it. She had stopped checking her phone for messages from Ashford Industries. She had stopped reviewing quarterly reports and acquisition updates in the endless stream of information that had consumed her life for the past 15 years. The company could run without her for a few weeks. It had hundreds of capable executives and thousands of dedicated employees. It did not need Victoria Ashford standing at the helm every single moment. But Emma needed someone to hold her hand during the difficult nights. Marcus needed someone to talk to when the fear became too heavy to carry alone. And Victoria, for the first time in years, needed to be needed for something other than her business acumen. She rented a small apartment near the hospital. Nothing fancy, a one-bedroom unit in a building that had seen better decades. The kind of place that Victoria Ashford, CEO of a $40 billion empire, would never have set foot in under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Every morning she walked the 3 blocks to Denver General. Every evening she walked back, stopping at a small diner on the corner for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie that reminded her of the mother she had lost years ago. She learned the names of the nurses on Emma's floor. She memorized the schedule of the pediatric specialist. She became a fixture in room 317, as much a part of the landscape as the beeping monitors and the uncomfortable plastic chairs. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. The armor she had worn for so long began to crack, not in dramatic breaks or sudden collapses, but in small fissures that appeared when she was not paying attention. A genuine laugh at something Marcus said, a tear shed over a milestone in Emma's recovery, a moment of vulnerability that she did not immediately try to hide. Victoria was becoming human again. The day Emma was discharged from the hospital, Victoria found herself standing at the window of her rented apartment, watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and rose. She had just returned from helping Marcus settle Emma back into their small apartment. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her crib, her breathing clear and strong for the first time in weeks. Marcus had looked at Victoria with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, something that made her heart flutter in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. For the first time in years, Victoria allowed herself to imagine a future. Not the future she had been building with Ashford Industries, the one made of quarterly projections and market dominance and the relentless accumulation of wealth. A different kind of future. One that included Sunday mornings and bedtime stories and the simple joy of watching a child grow. She thought about Marcus, about his kindness and his strength, and the way he looked at his daughter with such fierce, unconditional love. She thought about Emma, about her tiny fingers curled around Victoria's hand, about her trusting eyes, about the second chance she had been given. And she thought about herself, about the woman she had been before Theodore died and the woman she had become after, about the walls she had built and the walls that were now crumbling, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was not too old to start again. The phone rang, shattering the peaceful moment. Victoria glanced at the screen. Gerald Morrison, the family attorney. A chill ran down her spine. Victoria. His voice was grave. We need to talk. She sat down at the small kitchen table, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. What is it, Gerald? Richard came to see me this morning. He has made certain demands, and he wanted me to communicate them to you directly. Victoria closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. Richard had never been able to tolerate being outmaneuvered, and her walkout from the board meeting had been a very public humiliation. He would want revenge. He always did. What does he want? Your resignation from Ashford Industries. Gerald's voice was carefully neutral. Effective immediately, he wants you to step down as CEO and sell your controlling shares to a consortium of investors that he has assembled. And if I refuse, there was a long pause. Victoria, this is difficult for me to say. Richard has threatened to go public with certain information about Theodore. He claims that you abandoned your son, that you chose your career over his care, that your negligence contributed to his death. The world went silent. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat slow and steady despite the nuclear bomb that had just been dropped into her life. She could feel the cool surface of the kitchen table beneath her palms. She could smell the soup she had left simmering on the stove, the first meal she had cooked for herself in years. But she could not speak. Victoria, are you there? Yes. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant, hollow. Yes, I'm here. I want you to know that I don't believe any of this. I was there, Victoria. I saw how much you loved Theodore. I saw how devastated you were when he passed. Richard's accusations are lies, plain and simple. But they would be effective lies. Victoria's mind was already racing, calculating angles and outcomes, the way she had been trained to do in business and negotiations. A grieving father who claims his ex-wife let their baby die so she could focus on her career. The tabloids would eat it up. It wouldn't matter if it was true. The damage would be done. That's why I'm calling. Gerald's voice softened. I think you need to consider your options carefully. Richard is not bluffing. He has documents, medical records, testimony from people who worked at the hospital. He has constructed a narrative that, while false, would be very difficult to disprove. Victoria stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Denver skyline glittered against the evening sky. Somewhere out there, Marcus was putting Emma to bed in his small apartment, reading her a story, singing her a lullaby, doing all the things that Victoria had never gotten to do with Theodore at the mom. What do you recommend, Gerald? From a purely strategic standpoint, resign. Take the settlement Richard is offering. Walk away with your fortune intact and your reputation preserved. You could live comfortably for the rest of your life. Travel, pursue your own interests, leave the ugliness of corporate warfare behind. And Theodore's memory, what happens to that? Gerald was silent. If I resign, Victoria continued, Richard wins. He gets the company he has been coveting for 15 years. He gets to tell his version of events without any pushback. And Theodore becomes nothing more than a footnote in a business dispute, a pawn in his father's power play. She turned away from the window. I will not let that happen. Victoria, I understand your feelings, but no, Gerald, you don't understand. Victoria's voice was firm. For all these years, I have been silent about Theodore. I have protected his memory by keeping it private, by not allowing the world to turn him into a tabloid story. But Richard has changed the rules. He has made Theodore a weapon, and I will not allow my son to be used that way. She took a deep breath. Schedule a press conference tomorrow. I want every major news outlet there. I want cameras and microphones and reporters from every corner of the country. Victoria, what are you going to do? I'm going to tell the truth. The press conference was held in the lobby of Ashford Industries headquarters. Victoria had flown back to New York the night before leaving Denver for the first time in 3 weeks. She had not told Marcus why she was leaving. She had only said that there was something she needed to do, something that had been postponed for far too long. Now she stood behind a podium, bristling with microphones, facing a wall of cameras, and the expectant faces of reporters who had no idea what they were about to witness. The Ice Queen was about to melt. Thank you all for coming. Victoria's voice was steady. Her hands did not shake. Years of practice had made her an expert at concealing her emotions, and she would need every ounce of that expertise to get through the next few minutes. I have asked you here today to address the rumors that have been circulating about my personal life. As many of you know, photographs were taken several weeks ago showing me at JFK Airport with a man and a baby. Those photographs have generated considerable speculation, and I believe it is time to set the record straight. She paused, gathering herself. The man in those photographs is Marcus Holloway, a widowed father from Denver, Colorado. The baby is his daughter, Emma. I met them on a red-eye flight from Denver to New York when Emma was crying and Marcus was exhausted, and neither of them had anyone to help. Victoria looked directly into the cameras. I held Emma that night. I comforted her. I gave Marcus my personal phone number and told him to call if he ever needed anything. And when Emma was hospitalized with pneumonia several weeks later, I flew to Denver to be with them. She could see the reporters exchanging glances. This was not what they had expected. They had anticipated a denial or perhaps a carefully worded admission of some minor indiscretion. Instead, Victoria was openly confessing to actions that the media had characterized as bizarre and inexplicable. I know that many of you have wondered why a billionaire CEO would involve herself in the life of a struggling, single father. I know that the tabloids have suggested all manner of explanations, from secret affairs to hidden children to mental instability. Victoria straightened her shoulders. The truth is simpler and sadder than any of those theories. She felt the words rising in her throat. Words she had never spoken in public. Words she had barely spoken in private. Words that had been locked away or decades waiting for this moment. A long time ago, I gave birth to a son. His name was Theodore. He was born with a rare genetic condition, and he lived for only 3 days. The room went absolutely silent. For those 3 days, I held him. I watched him fight for his life. I told him stories and sang him songs and promised him that everything would be okay, even though I knew it would not be. And then I held him while he died. Victoria's voice cracked, but she pushed through. I have never spoken about Theodore publicly. I have guarded his memory like a sacred trust, keeping it away from a world that might not understand. But recent events have forced me to break that silence. She looked directly at the camera that she knew would broadcast her words to Richard wherever he was watching. My ex-husband Richard Ashford has threatened to release information about Theodore's death. He has constructed a false narrative suggesting that I abandoned my son, that I chose my career over his life, that my negligence contributed to his death. These accusations are lies. Vicious, calculated lies designed to destroy me and to seize control of the company I built. Victoria felt the anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice controlled. I will not allow Theodore to be used as a weapon. I will not allow his memory to be distorted by a man who abandoned his own grief and walked away from our marriage when the weight of losing our child became too heavy for him to bear. She paused, letting the words sink in. Theodore lived for 3 days. 3 days in which I learned more about love than I had learned in my entire life up to that point. Every second with him was a gift. Every breath he took was a miracle. And when he died, a part of me died with him. Victoria's voice softened. For years I have carried that grief alone. I have built walls around my heart. I have become the ice queen that the media loves to mock because ice does not feel pain. Ice does not bleed. Ice does not wake up in the middle of the night reaching for a child who is not there. She looked at the reporters, at the cameras, at the world that was watching. But Emma changed that. A crying baby on an airplane reminded me what it felt like to hold a child. A struggling father reminded me that grief does not have to be faced alone. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something other than sorrow. Victoria stood up straighter. I will not resign. I will not be silenced. And I will not allow Richard Ashford or anyone else to use my son's death as a tool for their own ambition. She gathered her papers. Theodore lived for 3 days. That is enough time to change a life. That is enough time to teach a mother how to love. And that is enough time to create a legacy that no amount of money or power can ever erase. Victoria stepped away from the podium. Thank you, I will not be taking questions. The aftermath was extraordinary. Within hours, Victoria's press conference had been viewed by millions of people around the world. The hashtag #3days trended on social media for days. Messages of support poured in from parents who had lost children, from people who had struggled with grief, from strangers who had simply been moved by the raw honesty of her words. The board of Ashford Industries convened an emergency meeting. Richard Ashford was removed by unanimous vote. The consortium of investors he had assembled quietly dissolved. The documents he had threatened to release were revealed to be distortions and fabrications easily disproven by the medical records that Victoria herself released to the public. The Ice Queen had won. But Victoria did not feel like a victor. She felt tired. She felt empty. She felt like someone who had finally put down a burden they had been carrying for decades only to discover that they had forgotten how to walk without the weight. She did not return to her penthouse office. She did not resume her duties as CEO. Instead, she delegated leadership to her most trusted executives and announced that she would be taking an indefinite leave of absence. She flew back to Denver that same night. Marcus was waiting for her at the airport. He stood in the arrivals area, Emma strapped to his chest, looking more rested than she had ever seen him. The dark circles under his eyes had faded. The perpetual tension in his shoulders had eased. He looked like a man who had finally found solid ground after months of drowning. I watched the press conference, he said as Victoria approached. The whole world watched the press conference. Victoria nodded, suddenly unable to speak. You told me about Theodore at the airport, but not like this, not the whole story, not the way you told it today to the whole world. I've never told anyone the whole story, Victoria said quietly. Not even my therapist. Not even myself, really. I've spent years trying to forget the details, trying to blur the edges so they wouldn't cut so deep. Marcus reached out and took her hand. The gesture was simple, almost instinctive. The touch of one human being offering comfort to another. Thank you, he said, for trusting the world with that, for trusting me with that. Victoria looked at Emma at the way the baby was watching her with those wide, trusting eyes. The same eyes that had looked at her on the airplane what felt like a lifetime ago. Can I hold her? Victoria asked. Marcus unstrapped Emma from his chest and placed her gently in Victoria's arms. The baby settled against her shoulder immediately, as if she had always belonged there. Let's go home, Marcus said. And for the first time in her life, Victoria understood what that word truly meant. The months that followed were a slow and gentle reconstruction. Victoria rented a house in Denver. Not an apartment this time, but an actual house with a yard and a porch and a room that could be turned into a nursery. She did not know what the future held. She did not know if this thing growing between her and Marcus would become something permanent. But she knew that she wanted to be ready, just in case. She spent her days doing things she had never done before. Grocery shopping, cooking meals that did not come from personal chefs, walking through parks and watching children play, sitting on benches and feeding pigeons like the elderly people she had always been too busy to notice. And she spent time with Emma, watching her grow, celebrating her milestones, being present for the moments that she had missed with Theodore. Emma's first tooth, her first steps, her first words garbled and unintelligible, but infinitely precious. Victoria documented everything, photographs and videos and journal entries that captured every detail of Emma's development. She told herself it was for Marcus, so he would have a record of his daughter's childhood. But deep down, she knew it was also for herself, for the memories she had never been able to make with Theodore. Marcus invited her to dinner one evening 6 months after the press conference. His apartment was small and cluttered with the debris of single parenthood, toys scattered across the floor, dishes in the sink, laundry waiting to be folded. It was the kind of mess that would have horrified Victoria a year ago, when her life was all clean lines and precise schedules in the relentless pursuit of perfection. Now it felt like home. On the wall above the couch hung a photograph. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes holding a newborn baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Sarah, Marcus's wife, Emma's mother. Victoria stood before the photograph for a long moment. "She was beautiful," she said softly. "Tell me about her." Marcus came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "She was everything to me. We met at a coffee shop when we were both 22. She was reading a book, and I accidentally knocked her coffee over when I was reaching for mine. She should have been angry, but she just laughed and said it was the universe's way of introducing us." He smiled at the memory. "We got married 3 years later. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. She wore her grandmother's dress, and I cried like a baby when I saw her walking down the aisle." Victoria listened, her heart aching with the familiarity of grief. When she found out she was pregnant, she was so happy. She had always wanted to be a mother. She used to talk about all the things she would teach our children: how to ride a bike, how to bake cookies, how to be kind to people who were different from them. Marcus's voice caught. She got to hold Emma for 10 minutes, that's all. 10 minutes of being a mother, and then she was gone. Victoria reached out and took his hand. "Theodore lived for 3 days," she said. 3 days of watching him fight, of holding his tiny hand, of telling him that I loved him. I used to count the seconds. That's all I got." She turned to face Marcus. "We have both lost the people we loved most. We have both been broken by grief and remade by love. And somehow we found each other." Marcus lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I don't know where it's going. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel less alone. I feel like there's someone in the world who understands what it's like to carry this weight." "I feel the same way." They stood together in the small apartment, surrounded by the chaos of everyday life, and allowed themselves to hope. 1 year later, they were married. The ceremony was small, just family and close friends gathered in a garden overlooking the Rocky Mountains. The autumn leaves blazed with color, reds and golds and oranges that seemed to set the entire world on fire. Victoria wore a simple white dress, no designer label, no couture styling, just a dress that made her feel beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with money or status. Marcus wore the same suit he had worn to Sarah's funeral. It was the only nice suit he owned, and Victoria had offered to buy him a new one, but he had refused. He wanted Sarah to be present at this moment in whatever way was possible. And Emma, nearly 2 years old now, served as the flower girl. She toddled down the aisle in a pink dress that matched the roses in her tiny basket, scattering petals with more enthusiasm than precision. The guests laughed at her antics, but Victoria could not take her eyes off the child. This was her family now. This man who had trusted her with his most precious possession. This baby who had changed her life on a night flight across America. This moment that she had never dared to hope for. The minister spoke the words that had been spoken at countless weddings before. Love and honor, sickness and health, for as long as they both should live. Victoria made her vows with a clear voice and a steady heart. She had spent years hiding from love, convinced that vulnerability was weakness and isolation was strength. But she had been wrong. Love was not a trap to be avoided. It was a gift to be embraced, even when it hurt, even when it scared her, even when it asked more of her than she thought she had to give. Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger. It was not expensive. It was not the kind of jewelry that Victoria Ashford, billionaire CEO, would have worn in her former life. But it was beautiful, a simple gold band that symbolized something far more valuable than any gemstone could convey. Commitment, partnership, the choice to face whatever came next together. "You may kiss the bride." Marcus pulled her close and kissed her, and the guests applauded, And somewhere in the distance, a bird sang, and the mountains stood witness to the union of two wounded souls who had somehow found their way to each other. And then Emma spoke. The guests had quieted, waiting for the couple to walk back down the aisle. The photographer was positioning himself for the perfect shot. The autumn breeze was carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Into that silence, Emma's voice rang out clear and unmistakable. Mama. Victoria froze. She looked down at the child, who was tugging at the hem of her dress, her small face turned upward, her eyes bright with the innocent certainty of a toddler who knows exactly what she wants. Mama, Emma said again, reaching up with both arms. Victoria sank to her knees. She gathered Emma into her arms and held her close, feeling the warmth of the small body, the silk of the fine hair, the flutter of the heartbeat against her chest. Tears streamed down her body, but she was smiling, laughing, crying all at once. For all those years, she had carried the weight of a mother's love with no child to give it to. For all those years, she had ached for the sound of a voice calling her by that sacred name. For all those years, she had been empty, and now she was full. Yes, sweetheart, Victoria whispered into Emma's hair. I'm your mama. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Marcus knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both of them. The photographer captured the moment, though no photograph could truly convey its significance. The guests wept openly, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious. The Ice Queen had finally melted. That night, after the reception had ended and the guests had departed, and Emma was asleep in her new bedroom, Victoria sat at the desk in their house and wrote a letter. She had been meaning to write it for months, maybe years, maybe her entire life. But the words had never come blocked by grief and fear and the terrible certainty that putting them on paper would make the loss too real to bear. Now finally she was ready. My dearest Theodore, you lived for 3 days. 3 days in which you taught me more about love than I had learned in all my years before you came. I held you for every one of those days. I memorized your face. I counted your breaths. I told you stories about the life we would have together, the places we would go, the things we would see. I made you promises that I could not keep. When you died, a part of me died with you. I spent years running from that truth-building walls, constructing armor, becoming someone who could not be hurt because she could not be touched. But you found me anyway. You sent me Emma. I know that sounds strange. I know that the universe does not work that way, that babies do not arrive as gifts from children who died before they could live. But I believe it nonetheless. I believe that somewhere in whatever comes after this life you were watching over me. I believe that you saw my loneliness and my grief and my desperate need for someone to love. And I believe that you brought her to me. A crying baby on an airplane, an exhausted father who needed help, a moment of connection that changed everything. That was you, Theodore. That was your love, reaching across the years, healing wounds that I thought could never be healed. Today I married Emma's father. Today I became a mother again, not to replace you, never to replace you, but to honor the love you taught me. Today I finally understood what you were trying to tell me in those 3 days. Love does not end. It transforms. It finds new vessels, new expressions, new ways of moving through the world. The love I felt for you did not die when you died. It waited patient and persistent until it found somewhere else to go. Now it goes to Emma, and to Marcus, and to the family we are building together. You will always be my first child. You will always hold a place in my heart that no one else can fill. But I am not empty anymore. I am not alone. Thank you, Theodore. Thank you for 3 days of perfect love. Thank you for waiting while I learned how to live again. Thank you for sending me home. I love you. I will always love you. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure that the love you gave me continues to grow. Your mother, Victoria. She sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in a small wooden box that she kept beside her bed. Inside the box were the only photographs that existed of Theodore: his hospital bracelet, a lock of hair that the nurses had cut for her before he was taken away. And now this letter, a message to a son who would never read it, but who was somehow present in every moment of Victoria's new life. Dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Victoria stood at the window of her bedroom, Emma in her arms, watching the sun rise over the city of Denver. The baby was still in her pajamas, warm and drowsy, her head resting against Victoria's shoulder. Marcus came up behind them, wrapping his arms around both of them. They stood together in the morning light, a family formed from loss and hope and the stubborn refusal to give up on love. "Good morning," Marcus murmured into Victoria's hair. "Good morning. What are you thinking about?" Victoria was silent for a moment, watching the light spread across the mountains. "I'm thinking about second chance," she said finally. "I'm thinking about how the universe has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most. I'm thinking about Theodore and Sarah and how their love is still alive in us." Marcus tightened his arms around her. "I think they would be happy," he said, "seeing us like this, knowing that we found each other." "I think so too." Emma stirred in Victoria's arms, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at the two adults who held her at the faces she had come to trust and love, and she smiled. It was a simple smile, the smile of a child who knows she is safe, who knows she is loved, who knows that whatever challenges the world might bring, she will not face them alone. Victoria smiled back, tears pricking at her eyes. Years ago, she had held a dying baby in her arms and felt her heart break into a million pieces. She had been certain that she would never recover, that she would spend the rest of her life as a hollow shell going through the motions of living without ever truly feeling alive. She had been wrong. Love had found her, on a red-eye flight across America in the arms of a crying baby and the eyes of an exhausted father. It had broken through the walls she had built, melted the ice around her heart, and shown her that even the most shattered pieces could be put back together. Not the same as before, never the same, but whole, complete, ready to hold love again. "Let's make breakfast," Marcus said. Emma's first breakfast with her new mama. Victoria laughed, a sound that still felt strange and wonderful coming from her lips. "I should warn you," she said. "I'm not a very good cook. I burned the soup last month." "That's okay, neither am I. We'll figure it out together." Together, that was the word that mattered. That was the word that had been missing from Victoria's life for so long. She had been alone, convinced that solitude was safety, that independence was strength. But she had been wrong about that too. Strength was not about standing alone. It was about knowing when to reach out, when to ask for help, when to admit that you could not carry the weight by yourself. Victoria had finally learned that lesson, and she had a lifetime ahead of her to put it into practice. She followed Marcus to the kitchen, Emma still in her arms, and began the ordinary, extraordinary work of building a family. Behind them, the sun continued to rise, flooding the house with light. A new day had begun.